The sky had opened up like a final judgment, a freezing deluge that turned the city's midnight lights into a blurred, neon-streaked watercolor. At a desolate bus stop, an elderly Asian woman sat hunched on a bench, her beige dress heavy with rainwater, and her gray hair clinging to her face in stringy, wet strands. She didn't know who she was or that her son's name was whispered in the streets as a king of the underworld. She only knew the rhythmic, terrifying drum of the storm against the glass. Sloane Mitchell, a young cleaner in a rain-soaked navy uniform, crouched low before the woman, one hand gripping a smartphone and the other steadying her fragile shoulder. Sloane recognized her as a silent fixture of the Beck mansion, a woman whose world was fading into the fog of dementia. Despite her fear, Sloane dialed an emergency number that felt like a live grenade in her hand. When the man who owned the city's silence, Hyun-woo Beck, answered with a voice like a predator's growl, Sloane's voice was urgent and protective. "Mr. Beck, it's Sloane. Your mother is here. She doesn't remember who she is." As the line went dead, Sloane remained in the downpour, shielding a forgotten queen while waiting for the lion to emerge from the shadows. The phone rang once, a sharp electronic shriek that seemed to pierce through the heavy drumming of the rain. Sloane's fingers, numbed by the freezing deluge, trembled as she pressed the device harder against her ear. There was no greeting, no polite inquiry from the other end. Instead, a low, dangerous hum of a voice vibrated through the line, a single word that carried the weight of a death sentence. "What?" It wasn't a question, it was a cold demand for justification, a predator's warning to whoever had dared to disturb his midnight. Sloane swallowed hard, her voice feeling tight and small against the roar of the storm. "Mr. Beck, it's Sloane Mitchell, from the cleaning staff." A heavy, impatient silence followed, the kind of stillness that felt like a storm gathering force just over the horizon. She took a shaky breath, looking down at the petite woman huddled on the bench beside her. "I'm at the bus stop on Elm. I found your mother. She's shaking in the rain, helpless." She added that last word because it was the only truth that mattered, a plea for the humanity she hoped still existed behind the legend of the monster. The line went dead instantly. Sloane stared at the blank screen, unsure if she had just saved a life or ended her own. She reached out, her hand in its wet navy sleeve steadying the elderly woman's shoulder, offering what little warmth she could. The woman looked up with glossy, confused eyes, her gray hair clinging to her temples in stringy mats. "He said to wait," she whispered, her voice a fragile murmur lost to the wind. Sloane could only nod, holding the hand of a forgotten queen while the world held its breath. Then, the headlights cut through the dark, two blades of white light slicing the liquid curtain of the rain apart. A black sedan, so polished it seemed to repel the very water falling upon it, glided to the curb with an impossible, ghostly silence. The back door opened, and Hyun-woo Bak stepped out. He didn't run or shield himself. He moved with a lethal, economical grace, the storm seemingly parting for him as if recognizing a more terrible force. He wore a dark suit, his face carved from granite and fueled by a silent fury. His eyes, chips of obsidian, found his mother first. For a fleeting second, the ice in his gaze fractured, revealing an abyssal pain before snapping toward Sloane. He didn't thank her. He simply knelt on the wet pavement, wrapping his own jacket around his mother's frail frame before lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. As he carried her toward the car, he turned back to Sloane, his expression unreadable and cold. "Get in," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for the cab she tried to mention. Sloane realized then that she was no longer just a witness. She was a loose end in a kingdom that allowed for no mistakes. and the black sedan glided onto the private drive of the Bayek estate, its tires whispering against the wet gravel as it approached the towering silhouette of the mansion. Inside, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft, ragged breathing of the elderly woman who had finally succumbed to exhaustion against the leather seats. Sloane sat in the front, her back rigid and her hands clenched in her lap, watching the raindrops race across the windshield. She could feel the weight of Hyun-woo's presence behind her, a cold, heavy pressure that made the air in the cabin feel thin and electric. When the car came to a stop, the doors were opened by silent men who appeared from the shadows with practiced, clinical efficiency. They whisked the mother away, and Sloane was left standing in the grand foyer, her navy uniform dripping onto the pristine marble floors she usually spent hours polishing until they shone like mirrors. Now, she was the only blemish on the perfection. Hyun-woo stood a few feet away, his wet suit jacket discarded, watching her with eyes that were unreadable and chips of obsidian ice. He didn't offer a word of gratitude. Instead, he spoke with the absolute finality of a king securing his borders. He labeled her a loose end to his driver, a term that made Sloane's pulse hammer against her ribs. He explained that he did not leave such things to chance, and that she was now a witness to a private disaster he could not allow to circulate. When she tried to protest, mentioning her morning shift at the plaza, he cut her off with a sharp, dangerous look. That was not a request, he told her. So she was to be taken to the staff wing, to a room she had only ever cleaned but never occupied. She was told to wait and commanded never to speak of what she had seen. Sloane was led down the familiar corridors, but the atmosphere had shifted. The mansion was no longer just a workplace. It was a gilded cage, and its master had just locked the door behind her. Over the next few days, she lived in a state of controlled tension. She was fed and housed comfortably, but she was never alone. Whether it was the silent driver following her through the gardens or the security cameras that seemed to track her every blink, she was always being watched. Her janitorial duties were suspended, leaving her with nothing but her own thoughts and the chilling realization that she had not been rescued from the storm, but had driven straight into its eye. The following days in the staff wing were a lesson in the architecture of silence. Sloane moved through the mansion like a phantom, her senses sharpened by the constant heavy weight of being observed. While her cleaning duties remained suspended, she was not idle. She was a guest who felt more like a specimen under a microscope. The tension in the house was a living thing, coiled and waiting. It was on the second afternoon, while she was walking through the manicured gardens, that the shadow finally took a human form. Min-jun, Hyun-woo's second-in-command, appeared as if he had materialized from the very hedges themselves. He was all smooth lines and polished edges, wearing a smile that was as bright as it was dangerous. Sloane felt a cold prickle of intuition. This was the man whose deference to Hyun-woo felt like a carefully rehearsed performance. "You are very brave, Sloane," Min-jun said, his voice a silky murmur that didn't quite mask the sharpness beneath. He moved into her path, forcing her to stop. "To call the boss at such an hour, with such news. Most people in this city would have looked the other way rather than hold a live grenade like that." He stepped closer, his predatory eyes scanning her face for any sign of a crack. He praised her bravery, but the words felt like an interrogation disguised as a compliment. Sloane kept her gaze lowered, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She offered a short, practiced answer, but she could feel his scrutiny like a physical touch. Everything in this conversation, every tilt of his head and every lilt in his voice, was a test. So as he spoke, Sloane noticed the subtle details that others might miss. The way his smile never reached the cold depth of his eyes, and the way the security guards visibly stiffened when he walked past. He spoke of loyalty and the importance of family, yet his tone carried a venomous undertone that made the skin on her arms crawl. He was the Viper's shadow, a man who viewed kindness as a weakness and information as a weapon. When he finally stepped aside to let her pass, his parting words were a soft, chilling warning wrapped in a pleasantry. Sloane walked away with a sudden, freezing certainty. She wasn't just being managed as a loose end. She was a piece on a board she didn't yet understand, trapped in a game where the price of a single mistake was undoubtedly fatal. The mansion was no longer just a gilded cage. It was a labyrinth of treason, and Min-jun was the one holding the thread. The suspension of Sloane's duties did not stop her from seeing the world through the eyes of a cleaner. For years, her professional life had been built on noticing the details others overlooked, the slight scuff mark on a baseboard, a misplaced chair, or a faint smudge on a window pane. As she moved through the mansion's opulent hallways, she began to apply that same meticulous observation to the house itself. The Beck estate was a fortress of legendary security, equipped with gates, sensors, and constant patrols that should have made it impossible for a confused, elderly woman to simply wander away unnoticed. While walking near the eastern perimeter of the gardens, Sloane paused. Her eyes narrowed as she studied a side gate that led toward the secondary service road. To a casual observer, it looked perfectly secure, but Sloane noticed the absence of the fine, undisturbed dust that usually settled in the hinges of a gate rarely used by the staff. She knelt, her athletic frame low to the ground, and saw the faint, overlapping indentations in the soft earth near the threshold. It wasn't just that the gate had been opened, it was the precision with which it had been left slightly ajar, just enough to bypass the magnetic sensor without triggering a silent alarm at the main security hub. A chilling realization settled in her stomach as she stood back up. Mrs. Bayek hadn't wandered off by accident. She had been guided. The security hadn't failed. It had been intentionally bypassed by someone who knew the rhythms of the house better than the guards themselves. Sloane's mind immediately flashed back to Min-jun's predatory smile and the way he had praised her for calling the boss at such a late hour. He hadn't been impressed by her bravery. He had been testing to see how much the cleaning lady had actually figured out. The air in the mansion suddenly felt heavier, thick with the rot of unspoken suspicions. Sloane realized she was no longer just a witness to a family crisis or a managed loose end. She was a witness to treason. In this house of polished marble and cold obsidian, the most dangerous stains weren't the ones she could scrub away with industrial ammonia. They were the ones hiding in the shadows of the men Hyun-woo trusted most. She looked up at the security cameras, realizing for the first time that the eyes watching her might not be trying to keep her safe, but were waiting for her to make a move that would justify her disappearance. The atmosphere within the mansion had become a thick, suffocating weight, a silence that felt less like peace and more like a predator holding its breath. Sloane moved through the marble hallways like a phantom, her senses vibrating with a new, dangerous awareness. She had spent her life being invisible, a ghost in the corners of grand rooms, and now that invisibility was her only shield. Tasked with maintaining the vast two-story library, she found herself perched on a rolling ladder, lost among the shadows of leather-bound classics. The room was a monument to power, cold and silent, until the heavy doors groaned open. She froze, her hand gripping the edge of a mahogany shelf as Hyun-woo and Min-jun entered, their voices low and sharp. From her hidden vantage point, Sloane watched as Hyun-woo stood before the massive fireplace, a silhouette of immense, brooding strength. Min-jun, ever the shadow, was pushing for aggression. He spoke of shipments moving through the port, insisting it was the perfect time to strike a rival known as the Viper. But Hyun-woo remained unmoved, his voice a low rumble that warned of traps and the folly of wasting strength on hyenas when a lion should wait for the throat to be exposed. Sloane saw the friction then, a subtle, violent spark between the master who demanded absolute control and the subordinate who was beginning to chafe under it. Later that night, unable to find rest in the gilded cage of her room, Sloane wandered toward the solarium. The glass walls revealed a garden bathed in a lie of moonlight, but the peace was shattered by a familiar, venomous hiss. She pressed her ear to a cold corridor wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was Minjun again, but the practiced deference was gone, replaced by a voice like a sharpening blade. "The old lion is cautious," he whispered into a phone, the words dripping with a cold, manic contempt. "He hesitates, but his caution is a weakness. We will proceed as planned. Make sure the package is ready." A chill traced a slow, jagged path down Sloane's spine. The old lion was Hyun-woo. This wasn't just a rivalry with an outside enemy. It was a coup brewing in the very heart of the kingdom. She was no longer just a witness to a family's vulnerability. She was the only one who had stumbled upon the treason, standing in the dark while the foundations of the house began to crumble. The heavy silence of the mansion was broken only by the rhythmic drumming of another storm against the glass. Sloane found Mrs. Bake in her suite during a rare moment of lucidity. The elderly woman sat by the window, her eyes clear and focused as she beckoned Sloane to sit. Taking Sloane's hand, she spoke in a fragile murmur about a version of her son the world never saw. The boy who would hide under the table during thunderstorms and bring her fistfuls of wilting wildflowers. "He built these walls so high to keep the thunder out," she whispered, her eyes beginning to cloud again. "But I think he trapped it inside with him." The connection shattered when Hyun-woo appeared in the doorway, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. His face was a mask of suspicion as he dismissed Sloane, but as she waited in the hallway, and she saw the mask finally crack. When he emerged, his shoulders were slumped with a weariness that stripped him of his crown. He leaned against the wall, a son watching his mother disappear into the fog of her illness. "She doesn't remember my name most days," he confessed, his voice rough and stripped of authority, "but she remembers the boy who was afraid of storms." For the first time, he didn't look at Sloane as a janitor or a liability. He looked at her as a person. He acknowledged that on the night at the bus stop, she hadn't called out of fear, but out of pity. In his world, people saw his mother only as leverage or a weakness to be exploited, but Sloane had seen a woman who was simply cold and alone. He pushed off the wall, his command settling back into place, yet the confession remained hanging in the air. "She is all I have left of me," he stated quietly, "the part that remembers wildflowers instead of blood." In that moment of shared vulnerability, Sloane realized she couldn't remain silent about Minjun's treachery. The betrayal she had uncovered wasn't just a threat to a powerful mafia boss. It was a threat to the broken boy who was still afraid of the thunder. Armed with a terrible resolve, Sloane sought out Hyun-woo in his office, a cavernous room of dark wood and glass that overlooked the entire city. He was standing before the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking every bit the king surveying his domain. Her courage almost failed her. She was about to accuse his most trusted man of treason. "Mr. Beck," she began, her voice barely a whisper. When he turned, his eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. As she forced the words out, telling him she had overheard Minjun calling him the old lion and claiming his caution was a weakness. Before the accusation could fully land, the world exploded. The armored glass behind him spiderwebbed and then imploded inward, a deafening roar swallowing the room as gunfire erupted from the hallway. Men loyal to Minjun stormed the office with the sharp staccato rhythm of automatic weapons. In the chaos, Minjun appeared in the doorway with a cruel smirk, sneering that Hyunwoo's caution had indeed become a weakness. Hyunwoo moved with blinding speed, shoving Sloane to the floor behind his massive oak desk, just as a spray of bullets tore through the air. He drew his own weapon, his voice a low rumble of pure fury as he realized the depth of the betrayal. "You let her out," he growled, referring to the night his mother was found. Minjun's laughter was manic as he admitted he had hoped the elderly woman would wander into traffic or be picked up by rivals to be used as leverage. The betrayal was more venomous than Sloane could have imagined. Minjun had used the most vulnerable person in the house as a disposable pawn in his bloody game of chess. The fight was brutal, a whirlwind of violence in the confined space. Hyunwoo moved like a phantom between overturned furniture, a deadly wraith in a tailored suit, but he was heavily outnumbered. For every one of Minjun's men he took down, more seemed to appear. Huddled behind the heavy desk, Sloane's heart hammered against her ribs. She was a cleaner, someone who dealt with messes rather than gunfights. But seeing Hyunwoo's raw, protective fury as he shielded her sparked something deep within her. This was personal now. Minjun had targeted the helpless woman she had protected. Her mind raced toward her cleaning cart, abandoned just outside the office door when the shooting started. On it sat a spray bottle of industrial-grade ammonia concentrate. As Hyunwoo was pinned down near the window, trapped and needing to reload, Sloane began to crawl across the rug, keeping her body flat as bullets whizzed over her head. She wasn't just the help anymore. She was the only one who could change the tide of the war. The office was a war zone of splintered wood and shattered glass, the air thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder. Sloane huddled behind the heavy oak desk, then her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Hyunwoo fight with a raw, protective fury. He moved like a deadly wraith between overturned furniture, but for every gunman he took down, two more appeared to fill the gap. The king was being overthrown in his own throne room, and Sloane realized that this wasn't just his fight anymore. Minjun had used a helpless woman and tried to kill them all. It was personal. She remembered her cleaning cart abandoned just outside the office door when the shooting began. On it sat a spray bottle of industrial-grade ammonia concentrate. Her mind raced toward the office's closed ventilation system, the intake grill positioned low on the wall near the door. While Hyunwoo pinned down the gunman near the window, Sloane began to crawl, keeping her body flat against the expensive rug as bullets whizzed over her head, embedding themselves into the walls with sickening thuds. She reached the hallway, her hand closing around the cool plastic of the spray bottle. Minjun was advancing on Hyunwoo's position, using a large armchair as cover and shouting for his men to finish the boss. Scrambling to the vent, Sloane twisted the nozzle to a fine mist and emptied half the bottle directly into the intake. For a few seconds, nothing happened, and then the colorless, potent vapor began to pour from the ceiling vents. It hit the gunmen first. Their eyes began to water and burn. They choked and coughed violently, their aim faltering in the sudden, invisible attack. Minjun spun around in rage, spotting Sloane by the vent with the bottle in her hand. He screamed in disbelief and raised his pistol, but the distraction was all Hyunwoo needed. He surged from behind the desk, moving through the disoriented gunman like a blade through silk. The power dynamic of Sloane's world was irrevocably shattered. In the heart of the storm, the quiet cleaner had learned how to make thunder. The fight culminated in a vicious confrontation as Hyunwoo met an empty-handed Minjun. They crashed against the walls in a brutal ballet of violence until Hyunwoo gained the upper hand. As he moved to finish the fight, Minjun lunged with a concealed blade from his boot, plunging it deep into Hyunwoo's side. Hyunwoo went rigid with shock, but with a roar of pure rage, he drove his fist into the traitor's throat, ending the fight and Minjun's life in a single devastating blow. As silence descended, Hyunwoo staggered, his hand flying to the fatal rose of blood blooming through his white shirt. He collapsed to his knees and Sloane rushed to his side, her fear replaced by a surge of adrenaline. She used his name for the first time, her voice shaking but firm, as she tore a strip from the curtains to apply pressure to the deep wound. "Stay with me," she commanded, her hand slick with his blood as he looked at her with a raw, unguarded focus. In that moment, trying to keep his life from spilling onto the floor, Sloane felt an overwhelming devotion take hold. The blood was warm and terrifyingly slick as it pooled over Sloane's hands, but she refused to let her grip waver. She pressed the makeshift bandage of torn curtain into the deep wound in Hyunwoo's side, and her eyes locked onto his as his focus began to drift toward the shattered windows. He was delirious, whispering of the wildflowers he used to bring his mother, confessing the truths he had hidden behind his crown of violence. In those desperate minutes before his loyal men swarmed the room, Sloane felt the last of her fear for the monster vanish, replaced by a fierce, protective devotion that anchored her to him. Weeks bled into a month of recovery in the mansion's private medical wing. Sloane was no longer the invisible servant who polished the floors. She was the fixture at his bedside that the proud king could not shake. She read to him when his vision blurred from medication and sat in the comfortable silence of two survivors mapping out each other's scars. They were no longer a Mafia boss and his cleaner. They were just Hyunwoo and Sloane, two souls who had found a strange peace in the wreckage of a coup. Hyunwoo grew stronger, and with that strength came a finality that settled over the Bayek Empire. He dismantled the remaining threads of betrayal with surgical precision, but he no longer stood alone. When his captains suggested Sloane be moved to a safe house, his voice carried a new, protective edge. She stayed beside him. The night the city finally stood still, they stood together on the penthouse balcony overlooking a carpet of diamond-bright lights. Hyunwoo turned to her, his dark eyes softened by a year of devotion that had melted the ice of his past. He did not offer her a life of peace. He was a man of the storm, and he knew it. He offered her his strength, his loyalty, and a kingdom he had burned the world down to protect. They call me a king, Sloane," he murmured, his hand finding hers. "But a king is a hollow thing without his queen." Sloane did not hesitate. She looked at the man who was both her protector and her storm, and chose him. 1 year later, she stood on that same balcony, no longer wearing a navy utility dress, but wrapped in crimson silk. She had walked into a midnight storm as a ghost and emerged as the unshakable center of a king's world, the only one who had ever truly known how to calm the thunder.